Welcome to A Century of Service. This is the continuation of our interview with Dr. the Reverend David Carter and his book on the Prairie Wings, which is the story of 34 flight training establishment, Medicine Hat.
Right.
And there's a few things we would like to expound on.
Let's go for it.
One of the things you talked about too, when things were coming over, and a bit about the politics at that time, how we ended up with a pre-OW camp, a flight training center, and the Defense Research Establishment, Suffield.
Well, it's a political question, and those of you who know me well with my background, and once I'm speaker, I have nothing to do with political parties. But in this particular case, in 1940s of Medicine Hat, we're in the chaos of the war, and the fact is that we don't know who's going to win the war. We hope it's going to be the Allied forces, but at this stage, the way Germany is overrunning Europe, I mean, this is not a done deal that the West is going to win. So in this particular case, you raise the matter of political, I guess, pork barreling in one sense. However, we're very fortunate. We had a very fine doctor, medical doctor in Medicine Hat, Gershaw. And he, at one time, had been on the CPR as medical practice. Anyway, he moved here before the war, and he was elected a couple of times to the federal government. He was defeated once. Then he was back. By the time 1940 came around, he's in the federal cabinet. So, Medicine Hat, again, I invite everybody back in terms of their imagination. This is not Medicine Hat as it is now. It's a little bushwater town, which exists mainly on agriculture. We've come through, we still haven't recovered from the First World War. You know, and then we had the Spanish flu, all the rest of it, which decimated families. And then there was a depression right after the First World War, and then trying to find employment. And then we have the dirty 30s, where it's dust and depression. Where I was born in the middle of a dust storm, south of Moose Jaw, around southern Saskatchewan. So this was economic difficult times. And then had been the stock market crash in 1920. So this is a whole different scenario than what we're accustomed to think of today. All right, so 1940, Senator Gershaw is there, and he has political clout. So he's from Medicine Hat, huge constituency. Right. First in 1940 came the establishment of the Defense Research Station, Suffield, Ralston, in the British bloc, and having to move all those ranchers out, and where we did chemical warfare testing. Rightly so, because what was one of the most terrible things invented in the First World War? Mustard gas and all of its related variants. All right, so that's happening up there. And some of that planning had taken quite a while. All right, so then the next thing to come to Medicine Hat was the Air Force Base, which, thank goodness, which in the First World War had been indeed used as an army training base. Mm-hmm. And then after the war, it was original stampede grounds for Medicine Hat.
The Medicine Hat exhibition grounds.
And then as soon as the Second World War broke out, all right, again, the federal government takes it over, and that becomes our airport. And it's all run under the Royal Air Force. Royal Canadian Air Force initially has a few personnel come here to guard the base under construction. After that, they're not part of this installation. So that makes this one like Moose Jaw, Swift Current, and a number of others. So, Senator Gershaw again. So where are you going to put all these prisoners of war who have been captured in North Africa, most of them? So put them out on the prairies. So he gets plunked the camp we get here to give us our triangular effect, which was a great economic boost to Medicine Hat. So aside from political party affiliations, it really helped in many ways to create the Medicine Hat which we inherit now. Because we now, as an airport base, we have an airport. And up here on the hill, we have the stampede grounds, the benefactors of the prisoner war camp. And as for Suffield, well, that's a whole nother issue. with regards to the Canadian Army and whatever else mysterious happens up there. So we have these things that came together thanks to the service of Senator Gershaw. So when people go along Gershaw Drive, they should at least say, well, thank you, because this is an important part of Canadian history, Alberta history, and especially Medicine Hat history. And so we're the benefactors of those kind of things.
So who was the first commanding officer, and how many personnel did he oversee?
Squadron Leader Hap Ellis, and he was an old man. He was 60, but he had he had married the daughter of someone high up in the Royal Air Force. So anyway, they put him over here as being in command. But the real person running the base in terms of flight instructors was, gosh, I'm gonna go for a minute. Come back to it. Scragg. So again, operationally, these people from different countries were here, and one of the examples is, we had the Czechoslovaks, we had the Polish, Norwegians, and people from Belgium, from Holland.
Australia?
We had some in briefly, and from New Zealand, but most of the Australians seemed to go over out of Moose Jaw and Mossbank. Free French. Now, for a moment, as I say, there are 50 graves there behind the Cross of Sacrifice. 3 others were killed here in training, and 2 of them were Royal Canadian Air Force. One was a fellow who went back to, the body went back to Nova Scotia, another one went to Saskatoon, and there was one other who's buried in Edmonton, and he died very early in the war, in the training plan here. So again, within these, where there were training deaths at every training facility, let's face it. But in the case of Canadians who trained here, then their bodies went back to their own home base, home city where they'd grown up. Now, of the 50 graves in Medicine Hat, Hillside, and I give compliment to Hillside Cemetery. It's the nicest run cemetery in all the province. The next closest to it is St. Margaret's Church, Eagle Butte. But they do a marvelous job, they really do. And they do respect all of the dead, but I admire the way that they look after the military graves. So kudos to them. Well, of the 50 graves behind the cross sacrifice, there are 3 empty graves. What say you? Well, again, it comes back to the tradition of various countries. So after the war, the French government, the Dutch government, and the Belgian government wanted the remains of their pilots taken back to their home country and there. But we've kept the headstones. And we have the original headstones, except for the one from Holland, where we're fortunate around Medicine Hat. We have so many folks who came over from Holland after the Second World War, and how marvelous the tradition is, how they look after our military graves. So again, when they decided to do a different version of the headstone, but nevertheless, it's still an empty grave. And I'm so pleased as a historian that they've kept the markers there. They haven't just sold the marker off to the grave off to somebody else, because it is such an essential part of military history here, and much to be honored. And every time I go to the cemetery, whether I'm taking a funeral or not, and I go up there maybe about every 5-6 weeks, I make certain I'm there so I can pay due respect to all of them.
Okay, the base, or the training station, formed a part of the social life in Medicine Hat also.
Yep, sure did. Sure did. In the back of the book, I list a number of the marriages. Mm-hmm. Again, thanks to Les Mann and his wife. Kept the scrapbook. When I was writing the book, I didn't have the time or the opportunity to go to, say, St. John's Church, where some of the marriages, Presbyterian, where some of the marriages took place, or to Fifth Avenue, where some took place, and St. Barnabas. And in each of those cases, I'm sure they have the marriage records, and they also have probably baptismal records. The great factor was, and go back to the example, when all the crew arrived Medicine Hat, they were great. It was a great parade, and everybody took them up to the base. And within a couple of weeks, they were having dances up at up there on site. So we have the beginning. Let's see, I forgot the name of the man who started up what became the Melody Maids. And then there was Elaine McCrae, who had the Melody Maids. And then Adele Armstrong, God bless them all. And then Tilly Gandon. Tilly was so popular, because she's a lovely lady.
And she could play the piano.
Play the piano, dance, and right there, I've been blindsided because I buried Tilly Gandon. And I was a good friend with Elaine McCrae. When I worked for Tommy Cook, one night I was there with 3 bodies. I was 18 years old. I was in this tiny room. Tommy was up there sick. The other guy was away sick. There I am with 3 bodies, and the person next to me is Elaine McCrae. And I thought to myself, because the only way out of there was way over there, and I'm 18 years old, and I said, what am I doing here? I've got to do something with my life before it's me on that slab. So, sorry folks, but this is one of the warp and woof of this book as I've reread it. And the same thing with my prisoner of war book. Forgive me as an author, and I hardly ever say this, but they're good books. And I'm surprised how good they are. But the other thing that's happened in the last few days, I've reenacted going back to the writing. And when I'm doing the writing, it's like I focus and the rest of the world goes away. But the other thing that's happened, as I've just shown you right now, I've buried. I've lost all these people. But I haven't lost them because I was so fortunate to be able to see them and for them to talk to me face to face.
Down at the Cypress Club, up on the wall right now, they have the Empire Club, and I gather the Cypress Club was renamed that during the war, and the badge of the Veterans Guard and the Air Force.
Okay, but and that's interesting too, because they were great. They allowed the officers to go there, but not the NCOs. And they ended up above the building that was second floor, above Hutchison. Remember where the horse used to be out front? That's where a lot of the dances downtown took place, but not for officers. You know how you guys work, so that's the way it goes. But again, Medicine Hat welcomed in terms of people coming into family homes. I know one lady, God bless her, up in Crescent Heights, and she was very much part of the Norwegian pilots who came. And some of them ended up, even some went out with Pete Armstrong to the ranch, his dad out the ranch, Cypress Hills. And so Medicine Hat opened up their hearts. They really did. And so it was a wonderful time. And of course, inevitably, you have marriages. And inevitably, you have some baptisms. And then after the war, many of them who were here in training did come back, as you pointed out earlier. And so Medicine Hat became the benefactor over the years, over decades, because these people came back, their families, all much a part of the warp and woof of southern Alberta. And along that line, in my cemetery at Eagle Butte, there's one of the former pilots who trained here. He's buried. And so he trained here, he fought in Europe, and then after the war he flew big aircraft all the way from London to
the British Airways.
British Airways down into New Zealand and Australia. Bill Webster, God bless his memory. And so he's buried there in St. Margaret's Church, Eagle Butte, together with a lot of ex-RCAF.
Bill's wife, Molly Webster, we've interviewed here, and she had an interesting experience in the Second World War. She was in the Southampton D-Day planning, so she saw Eisenhower and that. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Dear Molly.
yeah,
You know, she's a good artist, good
Yeah.
friend, and she served in the British Navy.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting, what I'd like to bring up a little bit is the political climate with respect to garnering support for the war effort and as it deals with the bases. And I would like to touch on some of the dignitaries that would have come here that would have been doing that kind of garnering of the support, and then from the advertising, we call it advertising today, but then it was promotion, I guess.
No, well, thank you, because that's a very important point. And again, I reflect in the book about in that first year that the base was operational. And again, building up community support along the lines that you mentioned. So at one stage, very early on, they brought in some Blackfoot Indians, Joe Crowfoot from up at Gleason and his family, because the people from Europe, I mean, they were raised in a generation of the Wild West and the glory and the purity of Aboriginal people. So they were wowed, because here's the family with full hairdress and all the rest of it. Shortly, and about the same time, the Governor General of Canada came here. Again, you know, evidencing the solidarity now between Canada and England and the Royal Air Force. And the other interesting thing along this line that happened, which I find very interesting, was that the brother of King George VI was here. And that's great. So we see him, you know, examining the personnel. Unfortunately, within a year, he's killed in a plane crash in Scotland when he's on a flight to Iceland, and he's in this bomber which just wiped out completely. So there's an association back to the royal family. And very quickly, I'm going to flip backwards into 1939, before the outbreak of war, when we have this wonderful visit of King George VI and the Queen. Now remember in this, this is a political history thing, because his brother Edward was not crowned king, and you know, we get into that business of the intrigue that Edward married Simpson, and she had been twice divorced, and she and Edward had connections. They were entertained by Hitler, so the royal family and the British government had to worry about, you know, what's really going on. Anyway, so he abdicated, along came George VI, and so you're trying to have stability with the image of the British Empire, especially the royal family. So we have this great event in 1939. I remember as a child going down the railroad track in Gull Lake, Saskatchewan, just to wave at a train going by. And one of the interesting parts about this wonderful trip, because it really rave notices across Canada, people turned out by the thousands, was the fact that when the royal family came over from England, they were accompanied by 2 cruisers. In 1939, before the war broke out, and the cruisers were loaded with British gold for safekeeping in Canada. That's part of, there's all these sort of little innuendos and things, you know. So hopefully people, when and if they ever live dangerously and buy the book, they'll find some of these different things. Because again, with history, and I believe this so sincerely, history can be adventurous, you know, it can be a pain, you know, there's ugly things, terrible, god-awful ugly things. But again, if we don't appreciate the past, to me, you can't really appreciate the present. And people, period, generally, not just politicians, should really learn more of the history of the past and to help it to sort of influence, hopefully, where we are now and what's coming ahead.
Yeah.
So I know I didn't really touch on it, but the support personnel on the base, how many were there, and who were they comprised of? Were they Royal Air Force people? Were they Canadian people, or what?
It was almost exclusively Royal Air Force, but you did hire some of the locals for, you know, some of the physical maintenance of the plant, but in terms of the fitters, the guy, everyone who looked after weather conditions, medical conditions, it was Royal Air Force personnel. Same thing would apply at Swift Current, Moose Jaw, one of the bases in Calgary. And so you've got this checkered pattern across Canada, but especially in the West, where the Royal Air Force bases were going at the same time as our CAF.
How many?
And as for the amount of personnel, I think it would only be, let's say maybe about 600 max. But then the training period, you'd be in for 3 months, and then out shipped to the East Coast or shipped straight overseas.
So it was 3 months. It was a basic pilot course. Was 3 months duration.
Yep.
And how many flight hours would they have actually graduated with?
When yeah. Well, in terms of the book, it's such a variation.
Yeah.
Early on, it was too short by far, but they were in such a hurry. You had to get them over there because the threat of invasion was still there. And it took a long time to get Bomber Command going. And, when it comes to Bomber Command, there's that fine display at Claresholm, a wonderful facility at Claresholm. And people watching the video, that's a good place to make pilgrimage as to the forces of all nations, but especially the Canadians and Bomber Command there, because the attrition rate was god awful.
Is that Nanton too?
Thank you. It's Nanton that because when as you've asked the question, I mentally trying. Oh, now was it Nanton or Claresholm?
Yeah.
But it's there because there was a base at Nanton.
Yeah.
There was also a base.
Fort McLeod.
McLeod, and then I'm thinking of the other one nearby that's east of Nanton. This great big field there where there were hangars still there fairly recently.
Thank you very much, David, for summing that up, and thank you for joining us in this edition of A Century of Service.